You don't remember me, do you? The judge's question stopped the courtroom cold. I stood at the defense table without a lawyer, my father's house hanging in the balance while my uncle's attorney sat across from me with the confident smile of a man who already knew how the story would end. Then the judge looked at me again. You were in uniform that night. My throat tightened. I had no idea what she meant. And then she said the name of the town where I had been stationed years earlier. That was when my hands started shaking, because I realized she wasn't asking a casual question. She remembered me, but I didn't remember her. 3 months earlier, I had thought the hardest thing I would ever do was bury my father. I was wrong. My father, Daniel Morgan, had died quietly in his sleep after a long battle with heart disease. He was 64, stubborn private, and the kind of man who fixed things himself, even when a professional could have done it faster. He had one prized possession that had never been about money, the small 2-story house where he and my mother had raised me. It sat on a tree-lined street in a quiet Ohio suburb. The paint was old, the kitchen cabinets were from the 1990s. The basement smelled faintly of sawdust because Dad had spent half his life repairing furniture down there. But it was home. My mother had died 6 years earlier. After that, Dad kept the house exactly as it was. Her blue coffee mug stayed on the second shelf. Her framed recipe cards remained beside the refrigerator. When I was deployed, he would send me photographs of that house whenever I was having a difficult week. Come home, he always wrote. I'll leave the porch light on. His will was simple. The house would go to me. Everything else was divided fairly among the family. My uncle Richard, Dad's younger brother, received some investments and personal property. He was not happy about the house. At first I thought his anger was just grief. Then the letters started. Richard claimed my father had promised him the property years ago. He said he had paid for repairs. He said Dad had depended on him. And then through his attorney, he made a formal claim against the estate. The first time I read the complaint, I honestly thought there had been a mistake. My father had never told me Richard owned any part of the house. I called several attorneys. The first wanted a retainer I simply could not afford. The second was already booked for months. A third reviewed the basic paperwork and told me the case involved probate and property issues that could become expensive very quickly. I had savings, but most of it was tied up in my transition out of the military and my plans to repair the house. I kept searching. The court date came faster than I expected, so I walked into court alone. That morning I wore a dark navy suit instead of my uniform. I tied my hair back and carried a folder containing every document I had managed to collect. Across the courtroom, Richard sat beside his attorney. His attorney looked polished, calm, and completely prepared. Richard looked at me and smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile that said he believed I had already lost. When the hearing began, his attorney spoke first. He argued that Richard had contributed substantial money toward the property over the years, and that my father had intended to transfer the house to him. Then he produced a document. A supposed agreement signed by my father. I stared at the page. My father's name was at the bottom. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The signature looked right, almost too right. Richard's attorney turned toward me. Ms. Morgan, do you have counsel representing you today? No, he nodded slowly. I see. There was something about those 2 words that made my face burn. The judge looked at me. Ms. Morgan, you understand that you are representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. The judge reviewed the document. Then she looked up. Do you have evidence that contradicts this agreement? I opened my folder. I had bank statements, property tax records, copies of my father's will, emails, notes. But suddenly, sitting beneath the weight of that courtroom, everything looked inadequate. Richard's attorney had professional exhibits, legal arguments, and years of experience. I had a folder and a grieving heart. I looked across at my uncle. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked relieved. Then the judge stared at me for several seconds. Her expression changed. Ms. Morgan. I looked up. You don't remember me, do you? The room seemed to disappear. I shook my head. No, Your Honor, I'm sorry, I don't. She leaned back slightly. You were in uniform that night. My pulse began pounding. What night? She named a town. Then a highway, then a storm. I knew the place, I knew the night, but I still didn't know her. The judge glanced down at the file, then back at me. I need to make a disclosure before we continue. Richard's attorney immediately sat straighter. The judge explained that she had encountered me years earlier under circumstances unrelated to the current case. She said she could not allow that prior connection to affect the proceeding. Then she made a decision I never expected. She recused herself. Richard's confident expression disappeared. The judge stood. Before leaving the bench, she looked directly at me. There is something in this record that deserves a closer look. Then she was gone. I stood there frozen. I had entered that courtroom believing I was about to lose my father's house. I left the courtroom with no victory, no lawyer, and no idea why a judge from years ago remembered me. But for the first time since Richard filed that lawsuit, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't walking toward the end of my father's story. I was walking toward the beginning of a truth he had never had the chance to tell me. The town the judge had named was Dayton, Ohio. The highway was Route 35, and the storm had happened 7 years earlier during one of the worst nights of rain I could remember. Back then I was still in the Army. I had been driving home from a training assignment when the rain became so heavy that headlights looked like blurred stars. Traffic slowed to almost nothing. Water ran across the highway, and thunder shook the windows of my car. Then I saw the wreck. A sedan had spun across 2 lanes and struck the concrete barrier. Its front end was crushed. Another vehicle had stopped behind it, hazard lights flashing. I pulled over. I remember grabbing my phone, calling 911, and running through the rain. There was a woman inside the sedan. She was conscious but trapped. "Please," she kept saying. "Please don't leave me." "I'm not leaving," I told her. I crawled close enough to reach her hand through the broken window. She was terrified. I remember talking to her about ordinary things because I knew panic could make a bad situation worse. I asked her where she lived. She told me. I asked if she had children. She said yes. I told her to keep breathing. Eventually, emergency crews arrived. Firefighters cut through the door, paramedics stabilized her, and police began controlling traffic. Before they took her away, she looked at me. "What's your name, Claire?" "Claire what?" I smiled. "Just Claire." She laughed weakly. Then the ambulance doors closed. I never saw her again. At least I thought I never did. Now, sitting in my car outside the courthouse 7 years later, I remembered her face. And suddenly I remembered the judge. She had not been a judge that night. She had been the woman trapped in the car. Her name was Evelyn Carter. After the hearing, I sat in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed. It was my uncle. "Hope you enjoyed your little courtroom performance." I didn't answer. Another message appeared. "You should settle while you still can." I turned the phone face down. For the first time, I understood something important. Richard wasn't worried about losing. He was worried about what might happen if I kept looking. The case was reassigned to another judge several days later. Richard's attorney sent another letter demanding that I agree to a settlement. The offer was insulting. He wanted me to give up the house in exchange for a small payment and a promise that neither side would pursue further claims. I read it twice. Then I remembered my father's handwriting. "Come home. I'll leave the porch light on." I wrote back that I would not agree. The next morning I began doing what I had learned to do in the military whenever a situation became confusing. I made a timeline. I wrote down every date I could verify. My father bought the house in 1998. My mother died in 2020. Dad updated his will in 2021. Richard claimed he had paid for major repairs beginning in 2019, but the bank records I had showed something different. Dad had paid the contractors himself. I spread the documents across the dining room table. Receipts, bank statements, property tax bills, insurance records, emails. Then I found something that made me stop. Richard claimed he had paid for a new roof in 2019, but one of the checks had been written from my father's account. I checked another, and another. Nearly every expense Richard claimed as his own had actually been paid by Dad. I leaned back in my chair. Why would you lie about this? The house was silent. Then I noticed something else. The disputed agreement Richard's attorney had presented in court was dated March 14, 2021. I knew that date. My father had been in the hospital that week. He had suffered a cardiac episode and spent 4 days there. I pulled out his medical records. March 14th, hospitalized, not at home, not signing property agreements, not meeting with Richard. I stared at the date again. My hands went cold. I called the attorney who had previously told me he couldn't take my case. He agreed to speak with me for a few minutes. When I explained what I had found, his tone changed. "Do you have the original document?" "No, only a copy." "Then get the original if you can, and don't accuse anyone of forgery yet." "Why?" "Because if you're right, the evidence will speak for itself." That sentence stayed with me. The next day, I contacted a local legal aid organization and explained my situation. They couldn't take over the entire case, but an attorney agreed to review some of the documents and explain what I should be looking for. She studied the disputed agreement. Then she pointed to the signature. "Your father normally signed his name like this." "Yes." She compared it with older documents. "It's similar." My heart sank, but she continued, "Similar isn't the same as authentic." She pointed to the date. "Your father's medical records may matter a lot here." I nodded. Then she asked, "Who witnessed this?" I looked at the document. A name was listed. Margaret Lewis. I knew that name too. Margaret had worked for Richard's company years ago. The attorney looked at me. "Find her." That night I searched through old emails and public records. I found an address. I wasn't sure what I would discover when I knocked on that door. But I knew one thing. My father had spent his final years believing he had protected his home for me. I was going to find out exactly what Richard was trying to take from me, and why he was so confident that I would never uncover the truth. Margaret Lewis lived in a small ranch house about 20 minutes outside Columbus. I sat in my car across the street for almost 5 minutes before I finally worked up the courage to knock. I wasn't afraid of Margaret. I was afraid of what she might say. If she confirmed that the document was real, I could lose my father's house. If she said it was false, I would have to prove it. Either way, the truth was going to hurt. I knocked. A woman in her late 60s opened the door. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she wore a sweatshirt and reading glasses. "Can I help you?" "Are you Margaret Lewis?" Her expression changed. "Yes, my name is Claire Morgan. I'm Daniel Morgan's daughter." She stared at me. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she opened the door a little wider. "Come in." Her living room was modest and comfortable. Family photographs covered one wall. She offered me coffee, but I declined. I placed a copy of the disputed agreement on the table. Margaret didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at me. "Where did you get this? My uncle's attorney submitted it in court." Her face went pale. I was afraid of that. My heart began pounding. "You recognize it?" She nodded slowly. "I recognize my name." I waited. She took off her glasses. "Claire, I never witnessed your father signing this document." The room seemed to tilt. "Then why is your name on it? I don't know." "You signed something?" "Yes." "What?" "A document Richard brought to me at work. He told me it was related to some business paperwork. I didn't read every page." My voice became quieter. "Was my father there?" "No, did you see him sign anything?" "No," I stared at the document. "Then why would you sign as a witness?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "Because I trusted Richard." That sentence sounded painfully familiar. I thought about my father. He had trusted his brother too. Margaret told me that she had left Richard's company a few months later. She had no idea the document would ever be used in a property dispute. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. Richard asked me not to talk about it. Why, he said it would only create problems. I looked at her. Problems for who? She didn't answer. I took a breath. Margaret, my father was in the hospital on the date shown on this document. Her eyes widened. Then it couldn't have happened the way this says. That's what I believe. She leaned back. "I have something." She stood and walked into a hallway. A few minutes later, she returned with an old cardboard box. Inside were notebooks, tax documents, photographs, and several envelopes. She searched through them carefully. Then she pulled out a small black notebook. I used to write down everything related to work. Dates, meetings, appointments. She opened it. Her finger stopped on a page. March 14th, 2021. I leaned forward. What does it say? She turned the notebooks toward me. Written in blue ink were the words, "Office closed early." Richard left around 3:00. No meeting with Daniel. I stared at the page. That was the same day, yes. I felt tears burn behind my eyes. For the first time I had something more than suspicion. I had a witness. I asked if she would be willing to speak with my attorney. Margaret hesitated, then she nodded. Yes. Before I left, she looked at me. I'm sorry, Claire. I stood. For what? For not asking questions sooner. I didn't know what to say. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those words. Not asking questions sooner. Maybe that was how family betrayals happened. Not in one dramatic moment, but through years of silence assumptions and people convincing themselves that something wasn't their problem. When I arrived home, there was a message from Richard. Stop digging. That was all it said. I stared at the screen. Then I deleted nothing. I saved the message. The next morning I contacted the legal aid attorney and told her what Margaret had said. She asked me to bring everything in. She reviewed the notebook, the medical records, and the disputed agreement. This is significant, she said. Can we prove the document is fake? Not yet. My disappointment must have shown. She continued. But we may be able to show that it could not have been executed when they claim it was. She explained that the next step would be authentication. We needed records showing where my father was that day, where the notary was, and whether Margaret actually witnessed anything. I nodded. Then let's find those records. She smiled slightly. You're learning what that court isn't about who tells the most convincing story. It's about who can prove what they say. That afternoon I requested additional property records. One document immediately caught my attention. The disputed agreement had supposedly been notarized by a man named Thomas Bell. I searched his name. He was still a licensed notary in Ohio. I contacted his office. He refused to discuss the matter without proper authorization, but he agreed to preserve his records if they were requested through the appropriate legal process. I passed that information to the attorney. 2 days later she called me. Claire, we found something. What? The notary journal. My heart started racing. What about it? The journal doesn't match your uncle's document. I sat down. What does that mean? It means we need to look much more closely at how this agreement was created. She paused. There is something else. What, the witness signature? I held my breath. The signature on the document may not match Margaret's original signature from the same period. I closed my eyes. For the first time I could see a path through the darkness. But then my uncle's attorney filed another motion. This time he argued that I was harassing family members and attempting to manufacture evidence. Richard wanted the court to dismiss my objections. He wanted the house, and he was becoming desperate. At the hearing, his attorney looked directly at me. You're chasing ghosts, Ms. Morgan. I said nothing. Richard leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. The attorney smiled. Then he looked at me again. You're going to have to prove all of this. I looked down at my father's folder. For the first time I smiled. Because I finally understood something. I didn't need to convince them. I needed to prove it. And somewhere inside a notary's old journal was the piece of truth my uncle had forgotten to erase. The notary journal changed everything. 2 days after my attorney reviewed it, she called me and asked me to come to her office. When I arrived, she had several documents spread across her desk. Claire, she said, the agreement your uncle submitted says your father signed it on March 14th, 2021. I know, the notary's journal shows no notarization that day. I stared at her. So the document is fake. Careful, she said. We can say the document is inconsistent with the notary's official records. That's different from proving who created it. I nodded. She continued. There's more. She handed me a photocopy. It was a page from the notary's journal. The entries around March 14th were clear. No Daniel Morgan, no property transfer, no signature matching the agreement. But there was something else. The notary had recorded that his office was closed that afternoon because of a family emergency. The supposed agreement had been notarized at 4:15 p.m. That was impossible. I sat back in the chair. My father had been in the hospital. The witness hadn't seen him sign. The notary's own records showed the notarization could not have happened. And yet Richard had presented that document in court as if it were legitimate. I felt anger rising inside me. My attorney noticed. Don't confront your uncle. Why? Because right now you have something better than an argument. You have evidence. I took a slow breath. She was right. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the person who had done this. Richard wasn't some stranger. He was my father's younger brother. He had eaten at our kitchen table. He had helped Dad repair the fence after my mother died. He had stood beside me at my mother's funeral. How could someone who had shared so many family memories become the person trying to steal my father's last gift to me? That evening, I went back to my father's house. I opened every drawer in his office. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for context. My father had always been organized. He kept receipts in labeled folders and wrote notes in old spiral notebooks. After several hours, I found a locked metal box beneath a stack of tax records. I knew the box. Dad had owned it for years. I found the key taped beneath the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were photographs, old bank statements, insurance papers, and several handwritten letters. At the very bottom was an envelope with my name on it. Claire. My hands began trembling before I even opened it. Dad's handwriting was unmistakable. My girl. If you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped would never happen. I stopped. I had to put the letter down for a moment. Then I continued. I know your uncle has asked about the house. I have told him no more than once. My eyes moved quickly across the page. Richard believes I owe him because he helped me during difficult years. He did help me. I will always acknowledge that. But helping someone does not give them ownership of what belongs to someone else. I swallowed hard. Then I read the sentence that broke my heart. Your mother wanted this house to remain a place where our family could always come home. I looked around the room. Her photographs were still on the wall. Her old sewing machine still sat beside the window. Dad had kept everything. The letter continued. If Richard ever challenges the will, don't fight him because you hate him. Fight him because I made a promise to your mother. I pressed the letter against my chest. For years I had thought my father simply wanted me to inherit a house. Now I understood. He wanted me to protect a memory. There was one more item in the box. A small USB drive. I stared at it. My father had never been particularly comfortable with technology. He still printed emails. Why would he leave me a USB drive? I took it to my laptop. There were only 3 files. The first contained photographs of the house. The second was a scanned copy of an older version of his will. The third was an audio recording. I clicked it. Static filled the room. Then I heard my father's voice. If you're hearing this, Claire, I'm sorry. I froze. His voice sounded tired. Older than I remembered. I didn't want to involve you in this. There was a pause. Then another voice entered the recording. Richard, my uncle. I recognized him immediately. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Daniel, Dad answered. No, I'm making it clear. You don't need that house anymore. I don't need it. Claire does. Richard laughed. You're going to leave everything to a daughter who barely comes home. My chest tightened. Dad's voice became firm. She serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment. Silence. Then Richard said something that made my entire body go cold. What if she doesn't come back? My father answered immediately. Then the house stays hers anyway. The recording continued for several minutes. Richard begged. He argued. He said he was in financial trouble. He said the house could save his business. Dad refused. Finally, my father said, if anything happens to me, Claire gets the house. There will be no confusion. The recording ended. I sat alone in the dark. I didn't cry immediately. Instead, I listened to it again. And again. Then I understood why Richard had become so desperate. He wasn't simply trying to inherit something, he was trying to erase my father's final decision. The next morning, I gave the recording to my attorney. She listened carefully. "This could be very important," she said. "Can we use it? We'll need to establish when it was made and authenticate the voices, but yes, it may help." I nodded. Then she looked at me. "There is something else we need to discuss. What your uncle may have known about this recording." I felt a chill. Because if he knew your father documented the conversation, he would have a reason to create another document that appeared to override the will. I stared at her. So, the fake agreement may have been created to contradict your father's actual wishes. The pieces were finally beginning to fit, but there was still one question. Why had the original judge recognized me? That afternoon I received a formal notice from the court. It concerned Judge Evelyn Carter, the woman who had recused herself. She had disclosed our prior encounter and provided the court with the emergency report from 7 years earlier. I read it carefully. Then I saw something I had forgotten. The report listed another person at the accident scene, Richard Morgan, my uncle. I stared at the name. Why had Richard been there that night, and why had the judge remembered me but not mentioned him? I called my attorney. "I think there's something you're missing," I said. She was silent for a moment. "What did you find?" "My uncle was at that accident scene." Another pause. "Claire," she said quietly, "then we need to find out exactly why." I looked at my father's letter sitting on the desk. For the first time I understood that the courtroom battle might not have begun with the house. The house might have been the last piece of a much older story, and I was finally getting close enough to see it. The hearing began at 9:30 on a gray Tuesday morning. By then, I had stopped feeling afraid, not because I was confident, because I finally understood what my father had taught me without ever saying it directly. When the truth is on your side, you don't have to make it louder, you just have to make it impossible to ignore. I walked into the courthouse carrying the same brown folder I had carried weeks earlier, but this time it was thicker. Inside were copies of my father's will, his medical records, bank statements, property records, Margaret's statement, the notary records, and the audio recording of my father and Richard. My attorney sat beside me. She wasn't representing me for free and she couldn't take over every aspect of the case, but she had agreed to assist me with the most complicated legal issues. For the first time, I wasn't completely alone. Across the aisle, Richard sat beside his attorney. His lawyer looked confident. Richard didn't. He kept staring at the folder in my hands. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. Richard's attorney argued first. He claimed the disputed agreement demonstrated my father's intent to transfer the property to Richard. He described my objections as the actions of a grieving daughter who had misunderstood her father's financial arrangements. Then he said something that made my jaw tighten. "Your Honor, Ms. Morgan appears determined to turn a simple property dispute into an accusation against her own family." I looked down. My attorney leaned toward me. "Don't react." I nodded. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Morgan, you may respond." I stood. "My objection isn't based on what I believe my father wanted. It's based on what the documents show." I handed the clerk the first exhibit. My father's medical records show he was hospitalized on the date this agreement was supposedly signed. Richard shifted in his chair. His attorney objected. The judge reviewed the records. Objection noted. Continue. I handed over the next document. The notary's official journal shows that the notarization listed on this agreement did not occur. Richard's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, we dispute the interpretation of that record." The judge looked at him. Then you may explain the discrepancy." He paused. For the first time I saw uncertainty in his face. My attorney submitted the relevant page from the notary's journal. The entry showed that the notary's office had been closed that afternoon. The supposed notarization was listed at 4:15 p.m. The attorney had no immediate answer. Then Margaret took the stand. I watched her walk slowly to the witness chair. She looked nervous, but she didn't look away. She confirmed that Richard had given her paperwork to sign years earlier. She confirmed that she never saw my father sign the disputed agreement. She confirmed that she had never met my father that day. Then the attorney asked her a question. "Ms. Lewis, are you certain the signature on this document is yours?" Margaret looked at the paper. "Yes." He smiled. For a moment I thought he had found a weakness. Then Margaret continued, "But I did not sign it as a witness to Daniel Morgan's signature." The smile disappeared. The attorney tried another question. "Isn't it possible that you simply don't remember?" Margaret looked directly at him. "I may forget where I left my glasses. I don't forget witnessing a man sign away his house. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. The judge asked for the notary records. The clerk presented them. The evidence was becoming difficult to explain. Then my attorney stood. "We have one additional exhibit." She submitted the audio recording. Richard's face changed. I knew he recognized it. The recording was played in open court. My father's voice filled the room. "If anything happens to me, Claire gets the house. There will be no confusion." Then Richard's voice. "You're going to leave everything to a daughter who barely comes home." And my father's answer. "She serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment." I looked at Richard. He was staring at the floor. When the recording ended, the courtroom remained silent. Richard's attorney stood slowly. "Your Honor, we would request time to challenge the authenticity of this recording." The judge agreed that authentication would be required. My attorney was prepared. The original device containing the recording had been preserved. The file metadata, along with testimony regarding where it came from, could be examined properly. There would be no shortcuts, no dramatic accusation, just evidence. Then something unexpected happened. The judge asked Richard directly whether he disputed that the voices belonged to him and Daniel. Richard's attorney leaned toward him. Richard swallowed. "No," he said quietly. The courtroom went silent again. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Morgan, are you saying you do not dispute the conversation occurred?" Richard closed his eyes. "No." His attorney looked at him sharply. Richard continued, "I just didn't think she'd find it." My heart sank, not because I had won, because I finally understood how far he had gone. The judge asked for clarification. Richard's attorney immediately requested a recess. During the break, Richard approached me in the hallway. His face looked older than it had that morning. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I understand enough. I was going to lose everything. You were trying to take Dad's house. I thought he owed me. He didn't." Richard looked away. "I helped him, and he thanked you." That wasn't enough. His voice cracked. I realized then that his greed wasn't really about the house. It was about resentment. For years, Richard had believed my father had received the better life. He saw the house as proof that Daniel had always chosen me over him. But my father hadn't chosen between brothers. He had simply made a decision about his own property. The hearing resumed. Richard's attorney no longer smiled. He asked for additional time to review the evidence. The judge granted a limited continuance for proper authentication and review. Several weeks later, the final hearing took place. The notary confirmed that his journal contained no record of the alleged transaction. Margaret confirmed her testimony. The medical records established my father's hospitalization. The audio recording was authenticated, and the property records showed that Richard had not made the payments he claimed. One piece at a time, the story Richard had built collapsed. Finally, the judge ruled. The disputed agreement was rejected. Richard's claim to the house was denied. The house remained with my father's estate, and under the valid will it passed to me. I sat perfectly still. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes. My father had won. Not because I had defeated Richard, because the truth had survived him. Outside the courthouse, Richard stopped me. "I'm sorry," he said. I looked at him. He was crying. "I know that doesn't fix anything." "No," I said, "it doesn't." He nodded, then he asked the question I never expected. "Can I see the house one more time?" I looked at him for a long moment, and I realized that winning the case had been the easy part. What I chose to do with the victory would tell me who I really was. I looked at my uncle standing outside the courthouse. For months, I had imagined this moment. I had imagined him angry. I had imagined myself telling him exactly what I thought of him. I had imagined walking away while he finally understood what it felt like to lose. But when he stood there with tears in his eyes, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. "Can I see the house one more time?" he asked. I took a breath. Yes. We drove separately. When I unlocked the front door, Richard stopped behind me. He didn't walk inside immediately. He just stared at the hallway. "Your dad painted that himself," he said. "I know." He smiled faintly. He hated that color. I almost laughed. He chose it. "I know," Richard said. "That's why I used to tease him about it." We walked through the living room. Everything looked exactly as it had before the lawsuit. My mother's photograph still sat on the mantel. My father's old recliner was beside the window. His tools were still organized in the basement. Richard stood in front of one photograph. It showed my father and Richard as young men standing beside their first car. They looked happy. I had seen that picture 100 times. But that day I saw something different. Two brothers who had once loved each other before money, pride, and resentment had gotten in the way. Richard touched the edge of the frame. He was always better at everything. I looked at him. That isn't true. It felt true. He sat down. When your dad bought this house, I was struggling. When he started his business, I was still trying to figure out mine. When Mom died, he was the one everyone depended on. He looked toward me. And then you came home wearing that uniform and he looked at you like you were the greatest thing he'd ever done. I didn't answer. Richard wiped his eyes. I thought this house was the last thing I could take from him. That wasn't the house talking, I said. That was your anger. He nodded. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said I lied. I looked at him. I know. No, I mean about everything. He admitted that he had exaggerated how much money he had contributed to the property. He had convinced himself that because he had helped Dad several times, he deserved the house. When Dad refused, Richard became bitter. He said he had pressured someone connected to his business to help prepare paperwork that could make his claim appear stronger. He did not try to excuse it. He knew there could still be consequences for what he had done. I listened quietly. Part of me wanted to tell him that he deserved every consequence coming his way. Another part remembered my father's voice. Don't fight him because you hate him. My father had never asked me to protect Richard from consequences. He had asked me not to become cruel. Richard. I said I can't pretend this didn't happen. I know. You hurt me, I know. You tried to take the last thing Dad left me. He looked down. I know, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you. He looked up. That was the first time I saw genuine relief in his face. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just the possibility of it. I told him that forgiveness would require accountability. He would have to cooperate with any legal process involving the false document. He agreed. He also agreed to repay legitimate debts and stop making claims against the estate. We didn't hug. It wasn't that kind of moment. Some wounds need time before they can be touched. But when he left, he paused at the front door. Your dad would be proud of you. I looked at the porch light. The same light he used to leave on whenever I was away. I hope so. After Richard left, I stood alone in the kitchen. For the first time, the house didn't feel like evidence. It felt like home. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Judge Evelyn Carter. It wasn't about the case. It contained no legal advice. She simply wrote about the night we met. She told me that after the accident, she remembered being terrified and hearing a young woman tell her over and over, I'm not leaving. She hadn't known my last name. She hadn't known where I lived. She hadn't known whether she would ever see me again. But she remembered my face. She wrote that she had never forgotten what it felt like to be helpless and have a stranger refuse to leave. Then she explained something that stayed with me. When she recognized me in court, she immediately knew she could not continue as the judge because of our prior connection. She had recused herself because justice had to be fair to both sides. She had not helped me win. She had simply recognized me. That distinction mattered. I folded the letter and placed it beside my father's. Two people from different moments in my life had reminded me of the same lesson. Character isn't what you do when everyone is watching. It's what you do when nobody can reward you for doing the right thing. I eventually repaired the house. I kept my mother's blue coffee mug. I kept Dad's workbench. I even kept the ugly paint color he had loved. But I made one change. I put a small table on the front porch. It became the place where family members could sit, talk, and remember that the house had never really been about money. It was about belonging. I also learned something practical from the lawsuit. If you have a will, keep it current. Keep property records, beneficiary information, financial documents, and important communications organized. Don't assume family members will automatically agree after you're gone. And if you become involved in a civil or probate dispute, don't wait until the last minute to seek qualified legal help. If you cannot afford private counsel, look for local legal aid organizations, bar association referral services, or other legitimate resources in your area. Representing yourself may be possible in many civil matters, but complicated property and probate disputes can become overwhelming very quickly. I learned that the hard way. I walked into court without a lawyer thinking that meant I had no chance. It didn't. But I also learned that courage doesn't mean refusing help. Sometimes courage means admitting you need it. And revenge, I thought I wanted revenge. I thought I wanted Richard to feel the same pain he had caused me. But when everything was over, I realized revenge would have given me another victory to celebrate. Justice gave me something better. It gave me the truth. And forgiveness gave me the chance to stop carrying the weight of what my uncle had done. I still remember that courtroom. I remember sitting alone. I remember his attorney smiling. I remember thinking I was about to lose everything. And most of all, I remember the judge looking at me and asking, "You don't remember me, do you?" For years I thought that question changed my life because she recognized me. Now I know it changed my life because it reminded me who I wanted to be. My father didn't leave me a house so I could win a war against my family. He left it to me because he trusted me to protect what mattered without destroying myself in the process. And maybe that's the greatest inheritance any parent can leave. Not money, not property, but a lesson about who you should become when life gives you every reason to become bitter. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, take a moment to think about what you would protect, what you would forgive, and what you would never compromise. And if you believe someone else could use that reminder today, share this story with them. If you enjoy stories about courage, family justice, and second chances, consider subscribing and staying with us for the next one. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't making someone pay. Sometimes it's walking away with your heart still intact.